To survive a freezing winter, the most dangerous thing you can do is seek out the warmest possible place. It sounds like a rejection of basic physics, a death sentence delivered in the form of a paradox, but for your ancestors, the search for a permanent heat source was often the first step toward a shallow grave. If you found a deep, geothermal cave or built a fire that never went out, you weren't just staying warm, you were tethering yourself to a single point in a landscape that was rapidly running out of resources. The moment you stopped moving, you became a stationary target for the most patient killer in the natural world. The math of calorie depletion. If you didn't understand that warmth was a secondary concern to mobility and resource management, you didn't survive to see the spring. We like to think of our ancestors as masters of the elements, but the reality is that they were desperate engineers of the impossible, using methods that would make a modern survivalist's blood run cold. You might assume that a cave was the ultimate sanctuary against a prehistoric blizzard, but for most of human history, a cave was little more than a damp, poorly ventilated tomb. While the popular caveman trope suggests our ancestors lived in stone halls, the archaeological record paints a much grimmer picture. Caves are rare, and the good ones were almost always already occupied by things much larger and hungrier than a human family, like the extinct cave bear, Ursus spilius. Evicting a 500-kilogram predator with nothing but a sharpened stick was a high-stakes gamble that many lost. Even if you succeeded, a cave is a geological heat sink. Stone walls pull warmth away from the human body with terrifying efficiency. Without sophisticated insulation, which didn't exist for much of the Paleolithic, sleeping on a cave floor was effectively like sleeping on a block of ice. Researchers like Paul Pettit have noted that many home caves were actually seasonal transition points, used only when the weather was mild enough to avoid the deadly damp of a deep cavern in midwinter. However, the idea that these damp stone shelters were the pinnacle of ancient living is a total fabrication, because the real engineering was happening out in the open, where the materials for survival were harvested from the dead. In places like Mezherik in modern-day Ukraine, ancient humans didn't wait to find a cave. They built fortresses out of the only material that wouldn't shatter in the deep freeze, mammoth bones. Around 15,000 years ago, groups of hunters assembled circular dwellings using the remains of dozens of mammoths. We aren't talking about a few rib bones stuck in the mud. These were architectural marvels. One structure utilized 95 mammoth mandibles as a foundation, stacked like interlocking bricks to create a windproof base. The tusks were used to create arched doorways and roof supports, over which massive animal hides were stretched and then weighted down with more bone. It was a macabre, ivory-clad village, a testament to a species that had learned to turn the carcasses of their prey into a literal shield against the wind. Inside, they burned bone fires, using fat-rich cancellous bone as a fuel source because wood was nearly non-existent on the frozen steppe. You would think that building a fortress of bone would keep the world out, but in reality, it only made the world inside much smaller and much more dangerous. A mammoth hut was a miracle of heat retention, but it also became a pressure cooker for disease and social tension. When 30 people are huddling in a space the size of a modern living room for 4 months, the air becomes thick with smoke, carbon monoxide, and the pathogens of every person in the group. This led to a dark adaptation that few people consider: sensory deprivation and the suppression of the human ego. To survive those long months in the dark, humans had to develop an almost hive-like social structure. There was no room for individual conflict when everyone was packed together for warmth. This is where we see the first evidence of complex needles and tailored clothing. In the Denisova cave in Siberia, researchers found a bone needle with a drilled eye dating back 50,000 years. This wasn't for making blankets, it was for creating airtight, fitted garments that could hold a layer of warm air against the skin. If your seam wasn't perfect, you died. Survival wasn't about being tough, it was about the precision of a stitch. While the engineering of clothing seems like a triumph of the mind, it actually masked a much deeper, more disturbing biological shift that was happening inside the human frame. Recent and highly controversial research by Dr. Juan Luis Arzuaga at the Cima de los Huesos site in Spain suggests that early human relatives, specifically Homo heidelbergensis, might have attempted a strategy that we usually associate with bears: seasonal torpor, or a form of hibernation. By examining bone lesions and growth patterns in the fossils, Arzuaga and his colleague Antonis Bartsiokas proposed that these early humans experienced a massive metabolic slowdown during the harshest winter months to survive on minimal food. Their bone growth would stutter and stop, leaving harshest lines that indicate periods of extreme stress and starvation. If true, it means our ancestors spent winters in a state of near death, their heart rates dropping, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue just to keep the brain's pilot light flickering. It wasn't a cozy winter nap. It was a brutal, months-long struggle against metabolic collapse where the body literally began to digest itself to stay alive. Although slowing the body down seems like the ultimate survival hack, it actually invited a far more gruesome necessity: the mathematical calculation of who deserved to keep breathing. When resources are finite and the metabolic cost of survival is high, the darkest methods move from the biological to the social. In many extreme northern cultures, and likely throughout the Paleolithic, survival was governed by a cold arithmetic that modern morality finds repulsive. This included the practice of geronticide or senicide, the abandonment of the elderly when they could no longer contribute to the group's mobility. If an elder could not keep up with the band as they moved toward winter hunting grounds, they might be left behind with a small amount of food and a fire, a practice documented in various forms among the Inuit and other Arctic peoples into the modern era. It wasn't born of cruelty, but of a terrifyingly clear-eyed understanding of the group's carrying capacity. One person's continued existence could mean the starvation of 3 children. In the dark of winter, the value of a human life was measured strictly in its caloric cost-to-benefit ratio. Stockpiling calories was the goal, but even a full larder couldn't stop the most desperate adaptation of all: the use of your own kind as a seasonal resource. When we look at sites like Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, England, which dates back about 14,700 years, we find evidence of something that goes beyond ritual. The human bones found there show clear signs of defleshing and marrow extraction, identical to how the hunters treated deer or horse bones. While there is evidence of ritualistic skull cup making, the systematic processing of the long bones suggests that during a particularly brutal winter, the dead, whether they died of natural causes or were sacrificed, were consumed to ensure the survival of the living. It is one of the darkest chapters of our history, but it highlights a fundamental truth. In a world where the ground is frozen solid and no plants grow, the human body itself is the only fresh meat available. Survival during the Paleolithic wasn't about man versus nature. It was often about man versus his own humanity. These brutal acts are often seen as signs of primitive cruelty, but they were actually the first glimmers of the complex, abstract reasoning that defines the modern human mind. To decide to consume a family member or abandon an elder requires a level of long-term planning and, if-then logic that most animals don't possess. You have to be able to visualize a future spring that doesn't exist yet and make the horrific choices necessary to reach it. This led to the development of what anthropologists call delayed return economies. Ancient humans began to ferment and store food in ways that were incredibly dangerous but highly effective. Take the Inuit practice of making kiviak, which likely has roots reaching back into deep prehistory. You take a seal skin, remove the meat, and stuff the hollow skin with hundreds of small birds called auks, feathers and all. You then seal it with fat, bury it under a rock for several months, and let it ferment in its own juices. By midwinter, the birds have broken down into a pungent, calorie-dense paste that provides essential vitamins that aren't available in cooked meat. It looks like rot, and to the uninitiated, it would be toxic, but to a starving group in February, it was a fermented miracle. But even the most ingenious food storage was useless if you couldn't control the very air you breathed, which is why the most advanced winter technology wasn't a weapon, but a hole in the ground. The invention of the sunken house, or pit house, was a game-changer for ancient survival. By digging the floor of a dwelling 3 to 4 feet into the earth, humans utilized the soil's natural geothermal properties. Below the frost line, the earth remains a constant, relatively warm temperature. A pit house with a small fire could stay at a survivable 50 degrees Fahrenheit even when the air above was 30 below zero. However, these structures had a dark side. Ventilation was often so poor that the inhabitants lived in a permanent state of mild hypoxia and smoke inhalation. Archaeologists have found that the ribs of people who lived in these structures often show signs of chronic respiratory infections. They survived the cold, but they did so by slowly destroying their lungs. They traded a quick death by freezing for a slow death by congestion, a compromise that defines much of early human technology. You would assume that these physiological and structural trade-offs were the limit of human endurance, but the most profound winter adaptation wasn't physical at all. It was the invention of the imaginary world. During those 4 to 5 months of near-total darkness, the human brain began to itch. With no hunting to do and no berries to gather, people were forced to spend 15 hours a day sitting in the dark, listening to the wind. This is where we see the explosion of prehistoric art and mythology. In the Lascaux and Chauvet caves, some of the most intricate paintings are found in the deepest, most inaccessible recesses, places that would have been used primarily during the winter. Researchers like Margaret Conkey suggest that these caves served as aggregation sites, where different bands of humans would meet during the winter to share resources and, more importantly, to share stories. The darkness of winter forced us to develop language that could describe things that weren't there, gods, ancestors, and the promise of a sun that hadn't been seen in weeks. Winter didn't just test our bodies. It acted as the kiln that fired the human imagination. We believe we conquered winter through technology, but the truth is far more unsettling. We conquered it by becoming comfortable with the horrific. To see the spring, our ancestors had to accept a world where they might have to eat their shoes, their dogs, or their neighbors. They had to learn the fat math, knowing that eating lean protein like rabbit meat in the winter would actually kill you faster through a process called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. Because the body requires fat to process protein, eating nothing but lean meat causes the body to dump its own fat stores and minerals, leading to diarrhea, exhaustion, and death. To avoid this, ancient humans became obsessed with fat. They would smash every bone of a kill to get to the marrow. They would render tallow into bog butter and bury it in peat vessels to preserve it for years. Fat wasn't just food, it was a sacred currency. This obsession is reflected in the Venus figurines found across Ice Age Europe, statues of women with exaggerated fat deposits. In a world of winter, fat wasn't a health risk, it was the ultimate sign of a person who had beaten the odds. This obsession with the holy fat led to one of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of human migration. For decades, scientists wondered how humans managed to cross the Bering Land Bridge during the height of the last ice age. The answer wasn't just better coats. It was a biological adaptation called non-shivering thermogenesis. Humans who spent thousands of years in the deep freeze of the mammoth steppe began to select for higher levels of brown fat, a special type of adipose tissue that generates heat by burning calories without the need for muscle movement, shivering. Modern humans still have some of this, mostly around the neck and spinal cord, but our ancestors were likely walking furnaces. This internal heating system allowed them to stay functional in temperatures that would cause a modern person's heart to stop in minutes. But this adaptation came at a price, an incredibly high caloric requirement. These people had to eat constantly. They were high-performance machines that could only stay running as long as the supply of mammoth fat remained steady. If the hunt failed once, the whole furnace would go out. While this biological heat was a marvel, it was still secondary to the most powerful tool in the ancient arsenal, the control of light. We often think of fire as a way to cook meat, but in a 24-hour winter night, fire was a psychological anchor. Without it, the human brain literally begins to disassemble. Seasonal affective disorder is a minor annoyance for us, but for an ancient human, the long night was a source of genuine madness. In 2014, a study by Polly Wiesner found that among modern hunter-gatherers, firelight talk is fundamentally different from daylight talk. During the day, conversations are about logistics and gossip. At night, they turn to spirits, myths, and social bonding. This suggests that the winter fire was the birthplace of human culture and religion. We huddled together not just to keep our toes from falling off, but to keep our minds from shattering in the face of an endless, indifferent blackness. The darkest method of survival was, ironically, the creation of the light of the human soul. However, the light of the fire eventually had to go out, and when it did, the true cost of survival was revealed. We see this in the teeth of ancient children. Enamel hypoplasia is a permanent scar on a tooth that forms when a child experiences a period of severe malnutrition or illness. In many Paleolithic populations, these scars appear like clockwork, year after year, marking every winter the child survived. These people weren't thriving, they were being forged in a cycle of near-death experiences. Every spring was a miracle, but it was a miracle bought with the suffering of the previous months. We find graves where mothers are buried with their infants, both having succumbed to the winter kill, the period in late February and March when the stored food ran out but the first greens of spring hadn't yet appeared. This was the hunger gap, the most dangerous time of the year, when the human body was at its weakest and the environment was at its most depleted. The resilience required to bridge that hunger gap is something we can barely comprehend. It involved the use of famine foods, things that were barely edible and often toxic if not prepared perfectly. Ancient humans would grind up the inner bark of pine trees to make a bitter, indigestible flour. They would boil leather strips and old bones until they turned into a thin, gelatinous glue. They would eat the stomach contents of the animals they killed, prized for the predigested plant matter and enzymes they contained. It was a level of desperation that redefined what food meant. They were opportunistic scavengers of the highest order, willing to consume anything that could be broken down by stomach acid. This willingness to eat the inedible is what allowed humans to occupy niches that every other primate had abandoned. We became the weed species of the planet, able to survive on the margins of existence by eating the very things that should have killed us. When we look back at the darkest methods of our ancestors, the cannibalism, the abandonment of the weak, the consumption of rot, and the metabolic near-death of torpor, it is easy to feel a sense of pity. But that pity is misplaced. These methods were the blueprints for everything we are today. The need to stitch airtight clothing led to the development of fine motor skills and complex tools. The need to store food led to the first understanding of chemistry and biology. The need to survive the long night led to the creation of art and language. Winter was the pressure chamber that took a standard tropical primate and crushed it until it turned into something else, a human being. The cold didn't just kill us, it edited us. It removed the parts of our biology that were soft and replaced them with a mind that could plan, a heart that could make impossible choices, and a spirit that could find beauty in a fortress made of bone. It's a strange thing to realize that your very existence is a victory lap for a group of people who once sat in a smoky, bone-ribbed hut and contemplated whether they should eat their own leather boots to see another sunrise. We have spent the last 10,000 years building a world that is essentially a giant shield against the winter. We have paved over the earth, built climate-controlled boxes, and automated the calorie supply so that we never have to face the fat math again. We live in a permanent summer of our own making, disconnected from the brutal cycles that defined every single one of our ancestors. We have the luxury of forgetting what they knew, that survival isn't a right, it's a series of horrific compromises. We have traded the dark methods for the comfort of the light, but the ancient cold is still there, just on the other side of the wall, waiting for the fire to go out. You are currently standing at the end of a 100,000-year-long chain of survivors who did the unthinkable so that you wouldn't have to. You live in a world where the winter kill is a historical footnote and a mammoth bone hut is a museum exhibit rather than a necessity. But the next time you feel the bite of a cold wind or watch the sun dip below the horizon on a short December day, remember the paradox of the warm cave and the price of the sewing needle. Your ancestors didn't survive the winter because they were lucky. They survived because they were willing to be as cold and as calculated as the season itself. They looked into the darkness and found a way to use it, turning the most brutal environment on Earth into the cradle of human civilization. It is a legacy of blood, bone, and iron-willed stubbornness. If they could see you now, in your heated room with your endless food, they might not even recognize you as the same species. But the cold remembers. Think about the sheer weight of that history the next time you turn up your thermostat. We've discussed the bone fortresses, the metabolic shifts, and the chilling social math of the Ice Age, but there is so much more to the story of how we escaped the cave and claimed the world. If you want to keep digging into these hidden chapters of the human story, join us for the next dive into the shadows of our past. There are plenty more rabbit holes to explore, provided you're willing to see what's waiting in the dark. Your ancestors did the impossible to ensure the fire didn't go out. Make sure you don't forget how they did it. Winter is coming for everyone eventually, and the ground is always hungry.